Welcome to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Center Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
Hey folks, if you're joining us, come on in. We're going to get started in literally a minute. Good afternoon. I am Professor Larry Jacobs. I direct the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs in Minneapolis. Before we get started, I want to just give you a heads up that we are excited to have your participation. You'll see at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A button. Please use it. Give us your questions. We love questions, and it becomes an important part of our conversation today. Today's program is part of the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School's Center, and we're focusing, we've been building a certificate in election administration, and we'll just give you a quick highlights of that. This is a pioneering program to share best practices with both current election officials and students who are looking to get involved in election administration. It's an online 12-credit program, and it's taught by prominent leaders in election administration, including one of our star panelists today, Jennifer Morrell. It's accessible 24 hours a day, anywhere in the world, so you can fit it into your busy schedules. Strong placement record for graduates, and we're now accepting applications for the spring semester until January 3rd. If you'd like more information, here is the email at the bottom of the screen. Please use it. We have got an exciting set of courses coming up this spring. Elections and the Law with Judd Choate, who is the Director of Elections in Colorado. Election Design with Whitney Quisenberry, who runs the Center for Civic Design. Voter Outreach and Participation with Astrid Ochoa. And Election Security, How to Protect America's Election with Maurice Turner, who's a cybersecurity fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy. And before we go on, I want to introduce you to a really important person in all of this, Lee Chittenden, who is the Executive Director of the Certificate in Election Administration. If you are an instructor or you are a student, you're no doubt interacting with Lee. If you've got questions, Lee is the person to go to. She is a powerhouse, and we're so delighted to have her running this program. Thank you, Lee, very much for what you're doing. We're very excited to welcome you to today's program, The Changing Landscape of Election Audits. And we have a distinguished panel. Pam Anderson is election policy and administration expert. She is, or was, the city clerk for Wheat Ridge, Colorado. She served 2 terms as the Republican clerk and recorder in Jefferson County, and has held important leadership positions for the Colorado County Clerks Association, including president and executive director. We're also joined by Bob Giles, who is director of New Jersey Division of Elections. He's also served on the Standards Board for the United States Election Assistance Commission. He's also worked with EISAC and NASED. He's also, on top of all this, he's an adjunct professor for Rutgers University's Center for Government Services, where he teaches election administration. And we're also delighted to have with us today and moderating today's conversation, Jennifer Morrell, who is a former local election official and an expert in election audits. She's a partner at the Elections Group and has been critical in implementing statewide audit reforms, including in Colorado and their well-known risk limiting audit. She's also authored a series on election audits entitled Knowing It's Right, which I'd highly recommend. It's one of the great resources out there. And with great pleasure, I turn things over to Jennifer Morrell. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Larry. Really honored and excited to be here. Pam and Bob, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really been looking forward to this conversation. I want to just add a little bit to Larry's introduction of you both, because I think it will help shape the conversation. As someone who's had the fantastic opportunity to work closely with both of you, I just want to say this is really exciting to get you both together. I know you both ran elections for many years at the local level. Bob, I don't know if that was mentioned in your introduction. That is something that is not an insignificant achievement. Pam, I thought of you in many ways as the mother hen of elections in Colorado, as the executive director of the Clerks Association. You served in that capacity the entire time I was a local election administrator there. And I know you thought a lot about auditing and validating elections as somebody who was always providing resources and support and guidance to Colorado's 64 counties, including support during that critical time when we implemented risk limiting audits. And now you are a consultant, and you've been able to share that expertise, helping jurisdictions of all sizes improve the way they administer elections. And I know I found that expertise incredibly valuable when you so graciously agreed to give me feedback on the Ballot Accounting guide that was part of the Knowing It's Right series that Larry mentioned. And now you're running for Secretary of State in Colorado.
Yeah.
So I know this changing landscape of election audits that we're going to discuss today, I'm sure is going to be a frequent topic of discussion for you over the next year. Bob, I guess if Pam is the mother hen of elections in Colorado, that must make you the rooster. Starting the hen house, so to speak. You support 21 counties in New Jersey, and you have this just tremendous legacy of shepherding your counties through everything from natural disasters to a not insignificant amount of change in the way that voting has been administered for years in New Jersey. And I've watched you champion and grow a statewide election security program and transition to voting entirely by mail in response to COVID in 2020. And now this year, implementing early voting with really no runway time to get it off the ground. And you did it remarkably well. And throughout all of this change, you've been helping your counties transition towards new voting equipment that produces a paper record, which brought to life an old post-election audit law that required you to stand up a state auditing committee, develop and implement audit processes and procedures, despite the fact that the law is antiquated in many respects. So I know you and I have had many conversations around today's topic of this changing landscape of election audits. I think you and hopefully those that are watching today know I've been an ambassador of sorts for election audits. I've worked to create tools and information to assist state and local election officials in creating robust post-election audit programs. I've spoken extensively about the need for other types of tests or audits to help validate the work we do and help us continue to professionalize and improve our practices. And so I think you probably both would agree, and I think it goes without saying that this year has been an interesting year with respect to election audits. We've seen them used by election officials to demonstrate the integrity of an election. We've also seen them used by non-professionals, non-election officials in an attempt to demonstrate an election was flawed or worse. In some instances, we've seen this term audit become weaponized. So I actually want to start the discussion on the positive side of election audits and give you both a chance to just share your thoughts on the value in continuing to discuss and define how we conduct election audits and efforts within the election community to expand election auditing. And with that, Pam, if it's okay, I'll start with you, and then Bob.
Sure. Well, thanks for that introduction, and hello, everyone. You know, I think it's been very positive over my career. I mean, I started looking at different types of audits back in 2007 in Colorado. For us, it was a real evolution. You know, audits have been around a long time. We've had them quite a long time. When I came in, it was all digital recorded electronic devices. We didn't have a paper trail. We had absentee paper, and that was increasing in popularity. And local election officials and integrity activists were interested in how do we validate how the systems were operating. And we actually started with a policy before we had the capability to go to a risk limiting audit. The legacy systems couldn't produce a record, a cast vote record to tell us how it interpreted the vote. The industry came forward with the next iteration to be able to do that. It took us 10 years. We actually delayed the implementation, the legal implementation, a couple of times. We maintained audits, the parallel audits, where we were hand counting and comparing it to the result, which was helpful. But in the meantime, we also evolved sort of our methods of voting, how people access the ballot, getting verified paper. So, you know, I think the positive thing that we saw in our state, you're starting to see across the country as well, jurisdictions exploring their options, both with technology and vote method and process and operational procedure on how to validate and their not just outcomes, but processes as well.
I think that's great, Pam, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that need to have some sort of flexibility in the structure and methods. Bob, thoughts?
Thank you, and also thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me here today. And kind of similar to what Pam was saying, we've actually had an audit law on the books since the early 2000s. You know, after Florida 2000, there was this wave of changes to election laws in the very early 2000s. We had the Help America Vote Act come out, all of that. And as part of that, at that time, we did not have voting machines that produced a voter verified paper audit trail. We had basically all DRE, direct recording electronic machines. So there was the law was passed to require us to move to some type of paper trail machine. And at the same time, they put our audit law in place, which was basically a 2% audit, but it had some language referencing the statistical power of 99, which at the time was considered the gold standard of auditing. And obviously audits have evolved a lot since that time. So eventually we did not, they suspended the law requiring us to go to the paper trail for financial reasons. And then we did not actually go to the paper trail. So this audit law sat on the books for a very long time. And now we've moved to some of the counties just through a natural progression have moved to paper audit trails. And now with early voting, which we started this year, all early voting sites have to have voter verified paper audit trails. So over the last few years, we started using our audit law, which is when it's just voting machines at a precinct or an election district, it's pretty straightforward. 2% of your districts, you audit them. And what was a bit confusing is what the meaning of statistical power of 99 really meant. So basically, we always kind of over audited to make sure we got to the 100%. So we were always covered. But now as we move on to early voting, where creating batches, or you no longer have election districts to audit, you have 9 days of voting on one, say 10 machines in a location. Well, all 9 days are contained in one machine, which could be thousands of votes. So when you start talking about auditing and you find yourself in a position of auditing large batches, it does make it challenging. But having audits are a good thing, and especially in light of the last few years, being able to say, yes, we have an audit law on the books, and yes, we do conduct audits, makes a lot of people feel better that, okay, I don't have to ask you for it. You're actually doing it already because it's in your law, I think is very helpful. And I think that, this year we had our gubernatorial election, very close, wasn't decided for a few days. So there was a lot of concern. Are we going to have an audit? And when we received those requests, basically our answer is yes, we have an audit law. We will be conducting an audit, and it put people at ease. So I think having that in law is really helpful ahead of time.
That's fantastic, Bob, Pam, both of you, thanks. I think you both mentioned sort of the focus this year that has occurred around audits and people discussing audits. You also mentioned the importance of a paper trail, or sort of the transitions that you both saw in moving to voting equipment that created a paper trail. And I think one sort of positive thing I've seen in the focus on this year is we have had a chance to sort of dig in just a little bit more into the details when we say we're conducting an audit or going through the Canvas or certification process. What are all the safety mechanisms? What are all the checks we go through as part of that? And one that I think is really important is chain of custody. The National Association of Secretaries of State recently approved some post-election audit recommendations. And one of those recommendations emphasized this, the importance of election officials ensuring chain of custody procedures throughout the audit. And when we talk about this, as you both know, this means the tracking the movement and the transportation of ballots and voting equipment through signature logs, security seals, witness signatures, etc. We also know that strong ballot accounting, so reconciling that number of ballots cast to those that were counted, is vital to a successful post-election audit. And these are two elements, I think, of election administration that I've heard you both speak passionately about, sort of maintaining that chain of custody. It ensures, in addition to all those other things, I think the other important element here is it ensures an election can be recreated if necessary, right? It's one of the reasons why election officials are the legal custodian of ballots and ballot equipment. And because of that, election audits are most often conducted under the authority of the election official. That's certainly the case in Colorado. I know it's the case in New Jersey as well, even though that the actual review of ballots may be performed by bipartisan citizen audit boards or poll workers or what have you. So I want to sort of shift a little bit and have you both sort of share some thoughts. One, just generally around chain of custody, why it's important to maintain that. And then thinking a little bit about the being the custodian of those ballots, why should audits be conducted by election professionals and not just handed over to special interest groups? And then any thoughts you might have on the role that independent observers play. And we can just sort of round robin, whoever has thoughts here, speak up, and in no order of those questions.
Do you want
to go first this time? Or...
All right, I'll jump in with the chain of custody, and we can kind of bounce around.
Sure.
And you're right, chain of custody is so critical because at the end of the day, you want, like you said, you want to be able to recreate the election or how the ballots have been transferred. It's so, if they leave the election site, where did they go? Who handled them? Who received them? So be able to create this trail, this chain of custody it really is one of the most important parts, because if there's a gap there, it opens up people's concern or skepticism that, well, what do you mean you don't know what happened to the ballots overnight? Like, so that's you want to make sure you can identify who had it, and that it's always been in trusted election officials' hands through that process. That yes, this was the assigned person, and they brought it in, they handed it off to the next assigned person, so you can show that. So I agree, like the chain of custody is a critical component of ultimately getting to the audit.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would reemphasize, as a local election official, you're sort of the general of the operation, right? You're putting out, even regardless of the size of your jurisdiction, you're putting out a pretty significant team. You're often working with folks that are been trained and worked for one day. And you want to know what's happening out there as well. From a legal perspective, there are legal mechanisms that recreating that election through documentation. So not only from auditing, but from process evaluation, you want to be able to demonstrate what happened in that given day. And often when I talk to people about elections, I say, it's the perfect mix of human and technological, and what it really is a giant accounting project. And the role that our poll workers and our election workers play, and our bipartisan teams, from a transparency perspective, couldn't be more important. That's a piece of that chain of custody. In Colorado, it's a citizen election that are appointed by the interested parties. And so that's important. And also it plays a role, that documentation plays a role in the certification, in the reconciliation. So that if you identify any sort of discrepancies in reconciling an election, you can go back and sort of recreate what happens there. Independent election observers, I think maintaining that custody through that entire legal procedure is super important. I always imagined, if I had a duty and obligation that if we identified in an issue election, I had to take that and contest my own election in a legal framework and go to court. And independent observers and having independent validation is something that we've built over time in Colorado. I think, sometimes we've seen, particularly in the last year, when you have independent observers, risk to seeing something that they have challenges putting into context of what that full election system is. And so, I do hear people say, oh, then there's mis and disinformation about what they're seeing. I think that's true. I think, placing our processes into context for the public, for our independent observers, is important for election officials, but also maintaining that access for independent observation needs to be maintained, and working together in how we communicate what we're seeing in a complex system is the big challenge that we all face. I don't agree with interested parties doing taking the election records and doing an audit outside of chain of custody. However, in Colorado, with digital systems, with technology, you can provide access to a lot of election records for independent verification. And I think that's a continuing conversation we need to have about how can we provide that level of independent auditability while maintaining the election records under a strict legal chain of custody.
Yeah, and I think, oh, sorry, Bob,
go ahead.
I was just looking at a couple of questions that popped up, and listening to you talk about the observer process sort of reminded me that the value in that is not just at this one point of time, right, when we do the audit or when we go through that canvas process, but having them there to sort of validate that chain of custody and the activities happening around that are really critical. Somebody asked in the Q&A if we could talk a little bit about that chain of custody process in all mail ballot states. And I will just say, for brevity, and Pam, Bob, certainly fill in if I've left any gaps, but from the time ballots picked up a batch at the post office or out of a ballot Dropbox to the time that they're sealed in a box, every time they change hands, meaning every time they move from being received in, sorted, gone through the signature verification process, are opened, the ballot is removed, it's flattened and prepared for scanning, all the way through. Every time those change hands, what we see is not only a log to indicate who has possession of those and what date, they had possession, but usually a unique batch tracking ID, often accompanied by a piece count so that we can see. It's that accounting project that you mentioned, Pamela or Pam, of have we lost or added any ballots in the course of doing this? So I think those are sort of my brief thoughts in answer to that question on chain of custody. Any others? And then I've got another question for you on.
Yeah, I mean, I saw the question. I think we pretty much duplicate the chain of custody for in-person and early voting systems as well. We also, I would just add, in addition to the custody logs from the incoming, we also have ballot inventory logs. So we know, how many ballots are printed, and some security on that side of the formula as well. I mean, our laws are very generous in issuing a ballot. We have really tight controls on receiving ballots, right? How, we can only receive one ballot back for an individual voter. And those types of system controls are important to have in place regardless of the vote method, and duplicating those controls.
So for New Jersey, even though we're not normally an all vote by mail state, in 2020 for the general election, we did run our presidential general election as an all vote by mail election. So that was the first time we started using Dropboxes. We required the Dropboxes have a camera on them, a security camera at all times, so you can review if there was an issue. You can go back and review that Dropbox to see if anybody tampered with it. When those ballots are picked up, in New Jersey, we have a Republican and a Democrat, so you have a check and balance there, picking them up. They're taking them, and we use a very specific type of Dropbox where it has an insert, so you're not actually grabbing ballots and putting them into a bag. You take the insert out, you close it, and you seal it. So those picking up the ballots never actually touch the ballots unless they fell on the ground. And then they replace that with an empty container. It's a bit more work, but it allows, if somebody were to watch, they would see, hey, that was closed, sealed, and then they record the seal and then they deliver it back. So, there's always you see that image of somebody's just rifling through ballots, and unfortunately that becomes an image and a narrative of who's touching these ballots. So we took extra steps as far as our Dropboxes, and then they come back. They stay locked in that container with the seal on it until it's time to open them with the election officials. And as far as just jumping back to the independent observers, one of the things that was a challenge last year and still is with COVID is to allow in-person observers. So we, the jurisdictions, when they couldn't have enough space, they put video cameras up. So, the transparency is important. So they would set up cameras in the room so the public could watch the proceedings, and the process, even if they couldn't get in because of COVID regulation. So that added an additional challenge to being as transparent as you possibly can, allowing people to observe the process, but still protecting everyone's health.
And Jen, I think one just last quick thing to add is the power of the voter. I think we've empowered the voter with being able to self-serve their own accounting of their ballot. So particularly like for mail ballot, ballot tracking and self-serving through your databases and being able to inform a voter where their ballot is in the process has been popular in Colorado and the other states that have implemented it. And it gives a sense of security on, has it been received, has it been processes? And every local election official knows that things don't just sort of go off into space. Voters, from when they're excited, they're calling you. When's my ballot coming? When's my ballot coming? So that's been a helpful tool as well around transparency.
And just to jump back just on the Dropbox and the other thing. So the state paid for all the Dropboxes, and so they're all identical. They're just identified by the county. And that was a big part of our education campaign. So you would know what it looked like. They were all the same. And that was important, especially last year. There was a certain concern that the post office would not get ballots delivered on time. People were so they were more comfortable putting in the Dropbox, knowing that it went from them right to an election official. So they knew an election official was picking up, it wasn't going through the mail stream. So I think that was very helpful last year and this year, that people feel more comfortable using Dropboxes than having it go through the mail stream.
Yeah, I think those are both two really good examples. And I love that, like empowering a voter or letting them know, this is the most direct or secure method. And then those notifications, whether that's through ballot tracking or, I know we've seen this in states with a cure process. Even part of that cure notification allows a voter to say, wait, that wasn't me. I didn't submit a ballot, or I did, or sort of help in sort of ensuring the integrity. And one thing that I like to point folks to when we're having this conversation is to remind everybody that elections are managed by professionals. So often, and I think we've done a lot better job of this over the years that the 10 plus years I've been in election administration, and sort of professionalizing it by ensuring that election administrators and their staff have had training in logistics, election law, information technology, security, and now increasingly in communications. And so when an argument is made, should we be moving this process to certified auditors, or should we change the way we think about this? I think the solution there are certainly a lot of things that the election community can learn from the auditing community, some principles and ethical guidelines that could be incorporated into part of that professional training. But despite all of that, this is as Pam mentioned, it's a very human process. As an election director, and I know you both have been there, both at the state and local level, you can't be everywhere. You can't be in every polling location. You can't be everywhere on a warehouse floor watching ballots being processed. And so this, again, to me, is one of the really important elements, I think, of election auditing. I love this idea that, among other things, it gives us a way to sort of ensure that the work is being carried out correctly. We know that some states have actually adopted in law a type of compliance audit that allows them to sort of spot check different processes. So not just talking about post-election tabulation, but different areas of election administration to ensure that work was done correctly. So I'd love to get some thoughts from you if there are other areas of election administration where there might be an opportunity to test or audit a particular process. And that may not necessarily be a formal sort of external audit. This could be an internal sort of audit or review that gets done. And given all that we've seen this year, would introducing more audits help or hinder the work that we're doing in trying to build confidence in this process?
Well, I'll start on that one, just because one really leaps to mind as the clerk and recorder in Jefferson County. When I came in, look, I was a history major, so statistics and audits really didn't hit my radar until, I'm going to give a little shout out, MPA program. I got an MPA in Colorado, and my husband, as you often do with partners, is an engineer and is in manufacturing. And so I felt like I was an apprentice through some of the quality assurance processes they do in the manufacturing field that made sense when I was looking at elections operations and other operations of clerk and recorder. We did other things besides elections. So one of the things that we looked at was our signature verification process, and not from any sort of disposition of someone's ballot, but is our training going well with verifying signatures for mail ballots? How are we doing in issuing ballots? Line maintenance. Do our judges get tired? Are our staffing levels appropriate? Registration data entry, what's the accuracy of that? And so I think there's a really large role around operational process audits as a leader, as a manager of the system that I've utilized. We're having discussions about how, running the professional association as a county clerk, we do best practice sessions throughout the year. And those great ideas get presented. I presented our signature verification checks, and We're discussing that from a statewide perspective. Where can we utilize tools to make that efficient and effective? That's the piece. We are under-resourced, underfunded. And so that is an additional piece to how do we improve our processes, become more effective, more efficient, and how can we validate that our training and our operations are working appropriately. And there are many areas that we can do even better work on that.
So, and I think in addition to that, well, we do with our voting equipment, you know, the seals that go on them, you know, you can call that an audit. Every before they go out, when they come back, you are checking all those seals. You're validating. You're conducting an audit of all your seals to make sure that you have the proper seals on your voting equipment, and that's really critical. And not just, you know, we have training in New Jersey for our voting machine technicians beyond just looking at the number. We have seal use protocol trainings that show what to look for tampering. So you don't want to just say, yep, that's the same seal, it's the same number, it matches. You really have to, touch and pull and tug and you know, and feel to see if it's been tampered with. So we go above and beyond. So it's you know, a different type of audit. You're auditing your seals every time they go out and come back.
Yeah, I think that's good. And I saw a few questions pop up from folks watching today, sort of reminding us of situations where things didn't go well, where maybe ballots were found later on or something like that. And in all of those instances, for me, it's very clear, had a reconciliation been done, had that ballot accounting been done at each sort of step in the process, those situations would have been averted. Same, Bob, like with the seals, sort of going through and ensuring both when they're sealed and after, sort of ensures that as they're going through that checking process, everything's there, everything's accounted for. But I think, Pam, you mentioned probably, you know, the number one constraint, sort of a state or a jurisdiction implementing a full sort of cadre of these sort of tests and audits or internal evaluations, however we want to term them. It really is about resources. And I think often when we say that word in these conversations, people think we mean money, and we do, but also we mean people, people with the knowledge and skills and ability to help participate in these types of programs and help create them. And I think those are really important to think about.
Well, I can tell you for our quality assurance on our signature validation, we look really closely in a bipartisan way at rejected signatures, but I always had questions about, you know, the single judge doing the accepted evaluation, and we have a very robust training. I went back to my stats book, right, to get what the random sample is. I think local election officials and probably even state, I won't speak to Bob, could really use experts helping them build those tools to say how, I'm a history major, or I'm a business major. Can you help me develop, an easy to use tool on how to sample, right? I mean, or something even like that. And we've got great people in this space doing that sort of work. And I think that's moved the ball a great deal.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I hope that we continue to sort of see the evolution of that thinking in election administration.
I did see a question, Jen, and I wanted to speak to sort of the transparency around audits. And we've had a lot of discussions about independent audits. I do think that, our public audit boards that are appointed by the interested parties are a really important piece. And around accessible election records and what's public, that, has a spectrum. We do have to protect voter privacy, and with paper records, sometimes we have to do some redaction. But in our state, we do have open records laws that provide a lot of access to that. So I noticed a question there, and I thought I'd talk about that. With respect to ballots, it's a little bit different. Our ballots are public, but they need to remain anonymous.
Yeah, I think that and how we are sort of communicating what we do and how we do it continues to be a challenge. And maybe that's kind of a good place to go with the conversation. So, my experience is that election testing, audit, and canvas are always done regardless of the outcome. And sometimes, and Bob, you've just experienced this, either because of a close margin of victory or because a candidate requests it, a recount might be performed. And then if there's still doubt, even after the audit, after a recount about the outcome, or a candidate feels they've been harmed in some way, a challenge to the outcome can be taken to court for resolution. And that's part of why that chain of custody is so vital. So we know that there's this process, this sort of continuum along the spectrum of things that we can do to try to alleviate any doubt. So I guess I have two sort of thoughts here, and happy if you want to avoid. One is a little bit political, happy if you want to pass on that. The other one's a little more straightforward, but I do wonder if we should, your thoughts about the concern around the attempt to use audits to change the outcome of an election. So essentially bypassing these validation processes that have already taken place, bypassing the courts. We've certainly seen some attempts at that. And then just thinking about that, in keeping that in the back of your head, if you care to comment on that, but also think about this transparency piece, like how have those efforts in your own states or in others, has that changed the way you're communicating about election audits? Has it changed the way you're thinking about performing these audits in the future?
So a couple things. So as far as the transparency, and in New Jersey, our Secretary of State, Secretary Way, is the chief election official. So, and she is a huge proponent of the transparency and being open and letting everybody see the process. So that's very helpful when it starts at the top and then works its way down. To have that kind of support definitely makes it easier. But as far as, and you touched on it, is there's this kind of chicken and egg thing where do you do the audit first or the recount? And does the audit then say, well, we don't need a recount because we did an audit? So right now our law, and I think there's other states that you have this bit of a conflict where, from a timing perspective, as well as just a process perspective, in that, do you audit before you certify, or do you certify and then audit? And then do you audit before? So in New Jersey, we have a recount period of 17 days after the election that you can ask for a recount. So if you're a losing candidate by one vote, you're not going to want anybody to touch those ballots before you have your recount. And that's where you get into this discussion and say, yeah, well, we're going to audit first. But if especially if you have hand-marked paper ballots where, things can happen. And there's that concern and there's that conspiracy theory. So do you say, well, when it's this close, it's only a few votes apart, you have 10,000 votes out there and the candidates are 3 votes apart, they're going to want everything locked down. They don't want you to touch anything until they can have the recount, they can have their observers there. Because if you start doing your audits, you potentially could touch some of those ballots. So it raises an interesting question, debate, as to when the audit should occur. So we're struggling with that in New Jersey. The way our law is written, you're supposed to audit before certification, but certification has to happen in such a tight time frame that there is not enough time, because we also have a law where, in the law, the voting machines and everything is impounded for 17 days. So it's in conflict. How can I open something that's impounded to do an audit without notifying every potential candidate that we could open a voting machine or open ballots with your potential race in there? So that's something we're talking about and struggling with right now, as far as how that happens and that time frame and that work plan. I know different states do it differently, and I don't have the answer for that, but I think you kind of touched on a little bit, recount versus audit, but I think that's a huge topic for discussion.
Yeah, it was for us in Colorado, Bob, and we actually legislated changes in our timeline to accommodate our process. And what we've determined is, we do our audit prior to our certification and our canvas, and then recounts can get automatically triggered, or the audit can trigger potentially a total hand recount, depending on discrepancies. And so there is a discussion, and I think we could talk about that more, about the utility of the recount. I think there is utility in the recount still, as we improve our auditing processes and as we take a look at efficiencies around what's the efficiency of the audit versus a full hand recount. I think that's an important topic that we should probably talk about more. But I do want to go back to the more political question, whatever risk that means. I don't think that an audit outside of the system, the legal framework, should be able to impact the outcome of an election. I think that formal process should be built into the legal framework, and changes to those rules. I think it gives all local election officials have been subject to rapid changes in the middle of an election, which we do not prefer, right? We want those, and I think it's important for the system for rules to be set in advance. We follow the rules, and that's the outcome, and that there are opportunities to audit, but also to contest. We've built in for that transparency, accessibility. Our ballots are public, but we actually have a blackout date prior to certification, so that those ballots can't be accessed digitally or otherwise in advance of the legal framework that takes place under chain of custody, because the rule of law is an important fundamental value for elections administration.
Yeah, I think all of this actually really resonates with me. My work specifically around implementing risk limiting audits, which you both have been. Bob, you've been involved in pilots in New Jersey, Pam, obviously with Colorado. I think one of the things I learned early on is that there's not a one size fits all. Every state has this sort of their unique flower, whether it's the voting culture within the state, the voting laws, the technology, the method of voting, where ballots get scanned, how they get stored. All of those sort of drive some of these things around the type and method of audit that can be done. And I think what I hear you both saying is there needs to be some flexibility there, especially when we get into that area that you discussed, Bob, where recount actually might make more sense, just going right to recount and skipping the audit, which in a sense accomplishes the same thing as an audit does, just with the entire, all of it is sampled instead of a portion of it. What it makes me think about, especially Pam, given what you just said, is are there principles around good audits that we should be focusing on? You talked about one, I think that's really important, meaning the audit itself, the method that we're going to use, the step-by-step that the election official and their staff and the public will adhere to is laid out ahead of knowing the outcome, ahead of the audit itself. Bob, you've done a great job in New Jersey, step by step, sort of to your counties. Here's how we're going to conduct an audit. I know in Colorado, the election rules lay that out pretty clearly. Are there other things, other principles that we should be thinking about? And here's a little twist. Is it time? I said 50 states, 50 unique flowers, 50 different ways. Is it time to start thinking about some sort of national standard around audits?
Bob, you want to go first?
I think that would be difficult. We're a nation of home rule. Our states are home, our counties. There are some things you can do. The problem is you have different equipment. It made it difficult even within New Jersey, where you have, multiple vendors that or multiple pieces of voting equipment that don't always audit the same. So to say this is absolutely how you have to do it across the nation could be very difficult. You know, and as you said, when we are writing up our guidance for an audit, we have to take that into account. Does this work for all of the different pieces of voting equipment being utilized in the state? How does it work for vote by mail ballots? How does it work for provisional ballots? How does it work for you know, in-person election day machines? So they're all a little bit different. So you're kind of customizing it down to the county level. So I think that could be difficult. There could be, you know, best practices nationally, you know, and that, but I think, or a model that you kind of work from. But I think having a federal kind of law or something to say this is how you audit, you could maybe say you have to audit, but how you audit, you know, and even with risk limiting audits. So over time, you know, the kind of the goalpost keeps getting moved on what is the best way to do one, and how should you do it? And there's different philosophies. So do you go with this professor versus that professor's, you know, logic or statistics? And so, you know, and for a lot of the lay people, the RLA is a black box to us. We, you know, we don't know the numbers behind it. And so you're saying that if you use this formula, you will get the results you are looking for, or the type of audit you're looking for. But to the layperson, and they start writing that on the board, you know, it's we don't understand that language. So it does make a unique challenge. Which version would you accept? So I think there are challenges trying to get, like anybody, getting everybody to agree on one model could be very difficult.
So I think Bob just made an excellent argument for us, Pam, as to why standards might be better focus, might be a better use of our sort of time and energy than methods. I know
I actually
talked about that. Yeah,
I actually completely agree, and I know we're very proud of what we've done in Colorado. But I want to reemphasize again, it took us 10 years to get here, and it wasn't just find the formula and build a tool that can do the math. It was systemic. So we have a lot of consistency amongst our jurisdictions with how voters interact with their ballots. So we centralize our counting, right? We don't do precinct-based counting. That made our audit more possible. I do think that there are some principles we could probably agree on from an audit perspective. One, we should have a verifiable piece of paper that we can always go back to, right? So that would be, you know, a basic principle of audits that we can talk to. And we've seen so much progress in the profession and in the legal framework across the country. I know I heard someone talking about, we had, you know, in 2016, 80% of voters voted on a voter verified piece of paper, or had a voter verified paper ballot. And now that number is 90%. And so we are moving the ball on fundamental system principles that make auditing more possible. I think the method, again, I agree with Bob. I think what we're learning is, and this is what we learned over 10 years, you know, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You know, as the systems evolve, and they always will, we're always looking for ways to improve. Have, you know, the professionals bring them in to give you that piece. Another fundamental principle is the transparency piece. You know, our tool, you know, is open source code, right? And as it's updated, that gets uploaded. And so I think, you know, and the documentation is public. The interaction, the auditors are independent, publicly appointed boards. And so I think starting there and giving tools, you know, on the process for jurisdictions to be able to self-select that fits their system, their voting culture, that will also increase confidence as you evolve as well.
So, and I think just one thing that Pam kind of triggered was how important the front end is on auditing, that people don't realize, preparing the ballots ahead of time. That was one of the big things we learned. So if you're like, for us, when we did the vote by mail, because we had what is a fixed percentage audit in our state, that you had to create batches. So instead of just taking your ballots, because the equipment can run ballots through, it doesn't care what town it is, it just can, you know, randomly put the ballots through and give you your results. that doesn't work for a fixed audit. You had to separate the ballots by town, then further separate them down to batches. So you could create this fixed percentage. Because it talks about no batch being larger than the turnout at a polling place. So there's this front end work that people have to realize. And again, maybe a different method where, oh, we don't care. You don't have to do 2%. You can just randomly select them. Then you don't have to do all that front end work. So I think that has to be part of it. Like, hey, this is a great way to audit. What does it mean on the front end? How much more work is on the front end versus the back end? So I think those kind of discussions need to happen when you're talking about what method you want to use.
Well, and I think on that transparency part, communication is also important to instill confidence. When you talk about audits, you start talking about things like diluted margin, and numbers, that is a really difficult thing to do. And over time, that's improved for us. We say, look, we take a piece of paper and we're comparing everything on that piece of paper with how it was counted, right? And to a predetermined level of confidence until we're that, and we keep doing it. We keep pulling pieces of paper until we're confident the outcome was correct. And we pull more paper, the closer the race is, less paper, the further away. And if anybody has recommendations on how to communicate that better to the layman, we are open to that. But we use those facts and that evidence and the pieces of transparency to try and say, look, we're doing the work of the people, and our elections are citizen elections. These are people from your communities that are doing this work, which is a really important piece of that validation and that transparency.
Just want, and I don't mean to jump, but
Yeah.
you bring up a good point on citizen elections, especially after 2020, where there was this doubt, and it's funny when I talk to my friends or people I know, and I'm like, no, this is how it works. The elections are fair and they're transparent. They're like, yeah, but we know you, Bob. But what about in other states? We don't know those people. Mm-hmm. So it's and you're right, getting that message out that it's your neighbors, it's your neighbors, your husbands, your wives, your brothers, your sisters. Like, these are the people that are doing it. These are, for the most part, these are people that are there, and the election workers are there because they believe in democracy and they want to be part of the process, and they just and it is frustrating times when you hear stuff like that. You're like, no, like, we're all the same, whether it's New Jersey, Wisconsin, Colorado. Like, we all have the same end goal for democracy, and you're right, these are citizen elections and we're all working towards that, and if the auditing helps people believe that, then that's fantastic.
Bob, that's an excellent sort of transition to our final question. Before I go there, though, there's been a lot of questions in the Q&A, and I know some were submitted ahead of time about the real sort of details and guts of how this works, where they can find resources, what constitutes a valid audit, things we just haven't had a chance to cover today. So I just want to let folks know, if you'd like to get an answer, feel free to forward that to the Humphrey School, and I will do my best to try to respond to that through email or some way, because there are great resources out there. We continue to see sort of more thought put to paper around these standards that we talked about, if nothing more than just starting to think about sort of an ethical sort of code of conduct for folks that engage in an election audit. But I want to just sort of end on the note around communication, Bob. And I've got about 60 seconds for each of you. The overarching goal of an audit should be to provide evidence, right? As you said, you both said that the outcome is correct, that the election was conducted accurately and fairly, and ideally we use the audit to build trust. How are we doing with that? And I say we, our country in general, are we succeeding? Is there more we could do? Are there challenges still to be met? And feel free, if you, in your 6 seconds, even want to point to just a success that you've seen somewhere.
Go ahead, Pam.
I think we're doing better and better every election, and in implementing systems that can provide confidence. This discussion we're having today, is Exhibit A. I think, those of us that have been in elections administration and policy for a while know, and the reason why we're still here is because it's the most fascinating field of technology and humanity and politics. And so, some of those challenges, what's the number one challenge? Human nature, right? and the human component. We've, been faced with mis and disinformation. I think that it's been a real challenge that, thank goodness, we've put these things in place, and we still have room to grow. We still have somewhere to go that we can be able to tap into. And then I think, the things that gives me hope and maintains is once people learn about this, they become poll workers or the election judges, or they get into the field, that gives me a great deal of confidence. And so the challenge is human nature, but also the hope I have is the human nature, right? Because we have seen election officials across the country continue to support our democratic institutions and put out accurate and faithful information for voters, and continue to look to provide easy voting access and secure and accurate elections. And we'll keep doing it.
Thanks, Pam. Bob, you get the last word.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I agree with what Pam said. And I think from our standpoint, the education is key. That educating voters that yes, we are conducting audits, and these audits will help people feel more confident. So in New Jersey, we post all the audit results on our website. So we stress that if you want to see your county's results of the audit, you can go to the website, and they'll explain, these are the batches we pulled, this is what we did. So it's right there in front of you. And like I said, when where we have them on Zoom meetings, and the transparency. So I think education and transparency are the two keys to get people to have that confidence in elections. And like I said, when we were getting all those requests, are we going to audit the gubernatorial election? And when we told them we have the audit law, yes, every county will be audited. That a lot of people felt at ease. They felt much better knowing that, okay, I don't even have to request it. You guys are doing it automatically. So I think that's key, that voters in the where it's required, they understand that. So I think that's really, like I said, education and transparency are the key.
That's awesome. Thank you both so much. I know you're incredibly busy, and I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation today. And thanks to everybody who joined us virtually. I look forward to the next one.